Hello there. We are coming to the end of chapter 41 in our study today and the end of our studies for this week. In the Cooksbury Bible Commentary, Linda B. Hinton says that Pharaoh acknowledges Joseph's God-given wisdom and makes him second in command in Egypt. Now, the powers given to him are like that of a vizier. Now, that was an office that is known from Egyptian records. A man named Reidy held such an office during the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose II. So let's pick up on chapter 41 then, verse 41, and we're going to read through verse 49. Genesis chapter 41, starting with verse 41. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. He was a vizier. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linens and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, which would have meant second position, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift a hand or foot in Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphenath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Now notice that the gifts that are given to Joseph as vizier, which is similar to the role of a prime minister, by the way, according to John MacArthur, the Zondervan Study Bible notes 3 symbols of transfer of authority. It's probably better to say shared authority. There's three symbols of that: signet ring, a robe, fine linen, and a gold chain. Now, all 3 of these are referenced in the book of Esther, so there's a historical meaning behind these. The signet ring was a royal seal, according to MacArthur, authorizing him to transact the affairs of Egypt on behalf of the Pharaoh himself. Now, the Hebrew words used here for signet ring and fine linen, by the way, have Egyptian heritage. So the original language, they were Hebrew words, but they really have an Egyptian meaning. And of course, the story is probably the reason for that. These are indeed precious gifts, but they are not the only gifts that Joseph received. Pharaoh also had Joseph ride in a chariot in second position, which signified that he was, of course, second in command, and that people were to bow the knee to him. Now, the Hebrew phrase for bow the knee also has Egyptian heritage and shows that we are approaching the fulfillment of Joseph's dreams in chapter 37. Remember that? 11 stars bow down to him, which he took and they took to mean his brothers, and the sun and the moon and the stars, or 11 stalks of grain actually bow down, and 11 stars and the sun and the moon. So we're starting to see that. Now, Joseph's family's not involved yet, but that being said, that of course will change very, very soon. But we're starting to see that possibility of fulfillment, what was happening in the story. Now, he receives an Egyptian name as well as a gift, Zaphenath-Paneah. There's a great deal of uncertainty as to what that name means. Well, it's Egyptian, of course. Hinton suggests that God speaks, he lives is the meaning. Certainly fits the storyline. And MacArthur actually agrees, but also suggests another one that he thinks is possible. The nourisher of the two lambs, the living one. Again, that very much fits the story. Now, which one is the better interpretation, honestly? We really don't know. I think the Zondervan Study Bible puts it best. The meaning is uncertain, and I think that's a good way of looking at it. Now, he's also given an Egyptian wife, another precious gift, Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. Now, her name likely means she belongs to the goddess Neith, and according to the Zondervan Study Bible. Potipharah, now we shouldn't confuse that with Potiphar. Sounds awful similar, doesn't it? But Potipharah was a priest, Joseph's father-in-law, and his name meant he whom the sun Ra has given. Now, On was located about 10 miles northeast of modern Cairo, and according to the Zondervan Study Bible, it was also called Heliopolis by the Greeks, and was a very important center for worship, of course, of the sun god Ra. Potipharah was a prominent person, well, appropriately named for the job that he had and the place that he lived. Now, we should consider the meaning, I think, of verse 46. Though I would say some Bible scholars overstate it. Joseph was 30 years old, according to verse 36, when he entered the service of Pharaoh. Now, some scholars see this here as a connection to Jesus, who began his ministry at 30, exactly. Now, I've listened to Bible teachers who really focus on this. Frankly, I've mentioned it a couple times so far, so I see it. But I also think there's a big difference between Joseph and Jesus too. In fact, the next few chapters, I think you're going to clearly see that. So I'm not going to focus on it as much as some teachers do. Linda Hinton and John MacArthur think it's actually more important that Joseph at this point has been in Egypt 13 years. Now think about that. That meant that he spent more than 40% of his life in a foreign land. More than 40%. The Zondervan Study Bible makes a good point too. It only took 13 years to become second in command in all of Egypt, from a slave to second in command. So really, I mean, we could definitely see the amazing things that God did through Joseph. Now, Joseph's task involved traveling all around Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. 20% of the food we know was stored in each city, and that came from the fields surrounding them, we find out in these verses. Now, a familiar phrase from the Old Testament is used here in verse 49, like the sands of the sea. That phrase always meant a number that was really difficult to number. Abraham was told that his offspring would number like the sands of the sea. So what this means is, obviously, they were having trouble keeping records on how much grain was stored. It was beyond measure. They stopped trying at some point. Now, what a practical plan Joseph came up with through God, of course. What God did here was very unusual. Now, we're going to see that. Most countries were not prepared for the famine in the way Egypt was. God warned Egypt, but many other countries around them did not get such a warning. So let's take a look at Genesis 41, 50 through 57 for the close of this chapter. That's 41, 50 through 57. Before the years of the famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was a famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt, there was food, a lot of it. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food, and then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Do what he tells you to do." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the world, and the known world at the time, came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. Now, it doesn't say it was as severe as it was in Egypt, but we get an indication that it was close. Okay? Now, Linda Hinton has a really good overview of this reading. Joseph flourishes in his new government position and in his family life. Though God sends the famine, God also sends the means to cope with it. The benefits of Joseph's wisdom extend beyond the borders of Egypt to all the surrounding countries that were known at the time. At other times in the past, Egypt had also served as a storehouse for hungry neighbors. We know that from Genesis 12. And there were other places in the Bible later where because of the Nile River, Egypt often had food when others didn't. So this was nothing new, actually. It was just for a longer period of time. Now, Joseph is also fruitful and is compensated for his years of affliction, according to MacArthur, by the birth of his sons. Joyous events indeed. Actually, his second son was named Ephraim, which literally meant fruitful. I mean, that's what it meant. The Zondervan Study Bible points out it's a wordplay in Hebrew. It reflects the fact that Joseph, that God really gave Joseph two sons. It sounds like the Hebrew word for twice fruitful. That's what Ephraim sounds like. Now, Joseph realized that God indeed made him fruitful in the land of his suffering. His life had completely turned around because of God. Now, his firstborn son was named Manasseh, which sounds like the Hebrew word for forget or forgetful. So I guess you can say Manasseh about me. Verse 51 tells us that he was named that because God made Joseph forget all his troubles and all of his father's household. Isn't that sad? He was glad to forget about them. Now, it's a sad thing when families can't get along. Now, to defend Joseph, his brothers threw him in a pit to die originally, and then they thought better of it and sold him into slavery. I could certainly understand why Joseph wanted to forget them, but sad thing nonetheless. But as we'll see next week, he will be reminded of his family very soon. John MacArthur makes a good point here that I want to consider. The names assigned to his sons depict the centrality of God in Joseph's life. God made him forget his troubles. God made him fruitful. God gave him the meaning of the dreams and the high position that he had. All that was the work of the Lord. Joseph was aware of this. Joseph was aware of what God did because God was at the center of his life in spite of all his troubles. God never left him, and Joseph never forgot that. All this happened to him, and it didn't harm his faith. In fact, I think these verses prove that his faith was strengthened. His faith strengthened his situation. Can we say that about ourselves? Do we see God at work in the highs and the lows of our life? We might pray more in the low points of our life, but do we see God at work more during those times? Because I think if we saw more of that, maybe we would be open to God the way Joseph was. You see, because Joseph was so open to God, he was blessed beyond measure because not only was God faithful here, Joseph was faithful. Joseph still listened to God. Joseph still listened for God. God was always the center of his life. God was at the center. Now, during the years of famine, Egypt becomes the breadbasket, literally becomes the breadbasket. The grain for bread is what they had plenty of. And because of the plans, obviously, that Joseph got from God. Not only does it save the Egyptian people, but the famine affected the world, as we know. So they were the breadbasket of the world during this famine. And people came from all over to buy grain. This fact sets up, of course, for us, as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story. Another land that was greatly affected by the famine was the land of Canaan. And the next series of chapters begins to speak of Joseph's family going down to Egypt. So we'll see that next time. Until then, may God bless you, my friends.